If you're surprised about the topic that I chose for this video in Module 4, then I haven't done a good job in representing myself. In my social work career, throughout this course and outside of it, I've had the privilege to expand my understanding of my ethics base, from just the views of some dead weight philosophers to someone with a different voice. I'm talking about Dr. Carol Gilligan, who wrote a book in a different voice, where she develops the ethics of care, something that she calls a feminist ethics, and it describes a different way of viewing moral questions from the viewpoint of girls and women, which is contrasted with the ethics that the dead white philosophers spoke about, who are, all of them, are male. In this case, I'll be speaking about Kant. And in this video, I'll be sitting with my educator hat on and fully excited for it. I want to open the dialogue and provide not just an understanding of these views of ethics, but hopefully provide some jumping points into the exploration of ethics, especially in the field of social work ethics. One of the most prolific views of ethics in Western society is the ethical view of Immanuel Kant. And while there are other ethical frameworks that influence our society, I think Kantianism will provide the most interesting comparison to the ethics of care, because both will often agree on what the right thing to do, but they will come about them in different ways. Kant uses reason as a central tenet and sole arbiter for how we ought to act morally. Where does the value of human life come from in Kant's view? Well, that comes down to reason. Kant postulates that the value of a human comes from the fact that human beings are capable of reason. And because human beings are rational creatures, Kant's argument is roughly as follows. 1. Kant claims that a rational being cannot rationally consent to being used as a mere means. 2. And as other rational beings, we can't take the autonomy of a rational being. 3. So they can't just be used as mere means. And 4. If they can't be used as mere means, they must be treated as ends in themselves. So what does Kant mean by end in themselves? The means in means to an end has value, but not inherently. It has value only because it helps us get to the end. For example, a hammer. A hammer has value only if it's useful to have nails hammered in. If we lived in a world that doesn't use nails, the hammer loses value. The idea of treating people as ends in themselves means that people will always have value, whether or not they can achieve things further. And keep this idea of ends in themselves in the back of your mind, because it's gonna come up again. So we established that people are important, but what does Kant say about how we determine ethical actions? Kant believes in what he calls categorical imperatives. Imperative means the things that you should do, and Kant makes a contrast between this and hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives are things that you should do if you want something. You should go to the university if you want a degree. Hypothetically. If not, then whatever. But categorical imperatives are things that you must do because of who you are. We, all of us, are rational beings, and this all goes back to reason. So as rational beings, we must will these categorical imperatives always and at all times, no exceptions. Kant has ideas on how we derive these categorical imperatives, and he calls these formulations. He has 4 of them, including treating humanity as ends in themselves. The 4 formulations, pretty loosely, are 1. Universalizability. If you can do it, everyone should be able to do it at all times. 2. Humanity as an end in itself. Humans are inherently valuable, and you don't need any further justification to treat them as such. 3. Autonomy. You choose to do moral actions because you are a human and you are rational, not because of other things, such as desire, which would take away your autonomy. 4. Kingdom of ends. Everyone is in it together, and the way that you act and which moral codes you autonomously decide needs to reflect that. These, again, are very loose terms, but I'll speak further about the kingdom of ends because that's what's going to produce the most interesting comparisons. The formulation of the kingdom of ends says that if your actions are moral actions and you follow the categorical imperative, it must be done as though you are making it in a law and the kingdom of ends, or all people, since all people are ends. That means when you do things, you have to keep everybody, all of humanity, in mind. The ethics of care, also called care ethics, is an ethical framework that's widely attributed to Dr. Carol Gilligan, and it's been developed by other thinkers. It's a form of ethics that's often talked about in social work as it's an ethics that's built around relationships. And social work is a profession built around relationships. To this end, it's considered to be a female ethical approach. Dr. Carol Gilligan studied and developed the ethics of care because her mentor had studied how moral development occurs, but studied from a male perspective with male standards. When she looked deeper, what she found was that boys and girls will respond differently in different ways to moral dilemmas and moral questioning. Where a boy might respond with ideas of justice and view their identity with how the world relates to him. So this means that the world acts as a comparison to his identity. On the other hand, the girl might respond with ideas of relationships and how she relates to the world around her. With this in mind, Dr. Carol Gilligan develops the ethics of care, centered around relationships. And in the ethics of care, the good is in meeting the needs of the others and in preserving and nurturing of relationships. One of the most prolific thinkers of care ethics is John Tronto, and she states that there are 5 ethical qualities of care. And these are: 1. Attentiveness. This relates to the idea that to care, it requires the ability to recognize others' needs so that you can respond to them. 2. Responsibility. Caring requires the undertaking of care, and Tronto differentiates the ideas of responsibility and obligation. Responsibility is chosen. Obligation is necessary. 3. Competence. One must adequately follow through fully in the fulfillment of needs of others. 4. Responsiveness. The person who receives the care must respond to the care. That is, not only does the care meet the person's needs from the care provider's perspective, but also from the person receiving the care. And 5. Caring with. Plurality, communication, trust and respect, and solidarity. These are the qualities that fall under the idea of caring with, where there exists this collective responsibility to meet the needs of everyone. Already, we are seeing that this is framed very differently from the way Kant views ethics. It's been said, even by practitioners of ethics of care, that the idea of care can be vague and subjective. But this is very much by design. Relationships and needs are going to be different, not just from the people receiving the care, but also between the people providing the care. After all, a child will need different things from their guardian than their teachers. Even the language that Tronto takes when describing the qualities of care is different from the way that Kant describes his formulations, where responsibility is deeply personal, whereas the obligation is innate, where Kant appeals to reason as the sole authority in all of morality. From how we view people to how we should act, the ethics of care instead centers around relationships. No action is good in and of itself, but it depends on the context that the action is taken. It depends on the attitude or the qualities that we exhibit when we perform these actions. So in social work in Canada, we have 2 companion documents on ethical practice. These are the Code of Ethics and the Guidelines for Ethical Practice by the Canadian Association of Social Work, or CASW. The CASW Code of Ethics sets out values and principles that will guide our ethical practice. The Guidelines for Ethical Practice provide guidance on how to apply these values and principles. To the Guidelines on admission, these guidelines are not intended to be exhaustive, nor fully prescriptive. The Code of Ethics does not have such a disclaimer. In this way, in speaking about values and principles, and about stringent ethical codes, we can begin to see the views and language that Kantian ethics uses. And while practitioners of the ethics of care will likely agree with these principles, it lacks the nuance and context to be viewed as coming from an ethics of care. But let's take a look at these values. 1. Respect for the inherent dignity and worth of persons. 2. Pursuit of social justice. 3. Service to humanity. 4. Integrity of professional practice. 5. Confidentiality in professional practice. And 6. Competence in professional practice. So right away, we can see some of the language that we talked about in Kantian and care ethics. Let's look at inherent dignity and worth of persons, and we can see the parallels between this and the idea of people as ends of themselves. This needs no justification. It is a value that just has to be. Or what about the pursuit of social justice and service to humanity, and the Kantian idea of the kingdom of ends and the care ethics quality of caring with? In the pursuit of social justice, it says that social workers believe in the obligation of people to provide resources, services, and opportunities for the overall benefit of humanity. It speaks to obligation. And what about these ideas of integrity, confidentiality, and competence in professional practice? This speaks to the idea of autonomy, that the practitioners of social work, in their pursuit of professional practice, take their duty and autonomy above self-desire and the understanding of the autonomy of their clients, colleagues, and community. And in this, we can see that Kantian influence in the code of ethics, a very male-centric type of ethical practice. And let's look at the CASW guidelines of ethical practice. How's this section instead? Well, there are 8 sections, each relating to the ethical responsibilities to different aspects of social work. And these are 1. Responsibility to clients. 2. Responsibility in professional relationships. 3. Responsibility to colleagues. 4. Responsibility to the workplace. 5. Responsibilities in private practice. 6. Responsibilities in research. 7. Responsibilities to the profession. And 8. Responsibilities to society. And these all speak to responsibilities as opposed to obligations. Not just that, it is sectioned by who we have a responsibility to and whose needs we are to meet. It is about how our role as social workers will be different depending on our relationship. And these guidelines are not prescriptive of behavior, but instead is a way of viewing the situation from the context of relationships between the social worker and the world around them. And of course, we can obviously contrast this to the more Kantian view of the codes and values and principles. These guidelines have a view reminiscent of care ethics revolving around relationships. And we need both of these documents. It seems to me that social work, as a practice, seeks to adopt both men and women's ethics. And this idea matters a lot, not just to me, but for all of us in this field of social work. Because if you want to be effective in social work, we have to be masters of different voices of morality and different ways of viewing the ethical process.